The Wyoming prairie stretched endlessly, the air thick with the weight of a summer that seemed reluctant to end. Dust swirled in the wind, and the landscape shimmered under the heavy heat. In the midst of this vast nothingness stood Eli Whitaker, a 10-year-old boy with no one to talk to but the wind and the sky. His father, Lucas, worked the ranch with quiet determination, but the grief that had followed the death of Eli's mother hung heavily between them. Eli had learned early to keep his feelings tucked away, not because he didn't feel, but because there was no one left to share them with. Eli's eyes scanned the horizon, his gaze drawn to the distant hills. There was something wild about them, something untamed, and it called to him. He had often wandered this stretch of land, hoping for a sign, something to fill the silence that echoed within him. But it was only on this morning, as he sat on a rock by the creek, that he saw him, the black stallion. The horse was a shadow against the pale morning sky, its coat glistening like midnight. No one knew where he had come from, but he had been spotted for weeks, always lurking at the edge of the ranch, always just out of reach. He was wild, untamed, and had a reputation for being impossible to approach. The locals called him Shadowman, but no one dared to get close. The horse was as free as the wind itself, and no one, not even the most seasoned cowboys, had succeeded in taming him. Eli's heart beat faster as he watched the stallion. Something stirred inside him, a sense of understanding, as if the horse wasn't just a wild animal but a reflection of the emptiness Eli felt inside. His fingers clenched around the straw hat in his lap, and he swallowed hard. Today was different. He could feel it. Something inside him told him that this time the stallion would come to him. Eli stood, his boots sinking into the soft earth as he slowly moved closer to the fence line. His steps were deliberate, measured, as if not to disturb the fragile silence between him and the wild horse. The wind shifted, and for a moment the prairie seemed to hold its breath. Shadowman, standing on the ridge, turned his head slightly, his dark eyes locking onto Eli's. There was no fear, no hesitation, only a knowing that passed between them. Eli reached for the apple in his pocket and rolled it gently toward the stallion. The fruit glided across the grass, coming to a stop just inches away from the horse. Shadowman sniffed the air, then the apple, but made no move to take it. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his gaze never leaving Eli's face. Eli's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't retreat. He understood. The stallion wasn't testing him, it was waiting. For weeks, Eli had been coming to this spot, always alone, always in silence. But today something had shifted. He slowly took off his hat and set it down beside him. It wasn't a gesture of submission but of respect. He didn't need the hat to protect him from the sun. He needed it to be vulnerable, to show Shadowman that he wasn't a threat. The horse's ears flicked forward as if in recognition. For a long moment, neither moved. The world seemed to pause, the wind holding its breath. And then, slowly, cautiously, Shadowman took a step forward. Eli's breath caught in his throat. He didn't move, didn't dare to. He simply waited, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. The horse was close now, so close that Eli could hear the soft snort of his breath, feel the warmth radiating from his coat. And then, almost imperceptibly, the stallion lowered his head, just enough for Eli to reach out. Tentatively, Eli extended his hand, his fingers brushing the stallion's muzzle. It was warm, rough, real. The connection, brief as it was, sent a surge of electricity through Eli's body. And just as suddenly, Shadowman pulled back, turning sharply and galloping away, his hooves thundering across the earth. Eli stood still, his hand still reaching out as if expecting the horse to return. But the stallion was gone, disappearing into the vastness of the prairie. Eli stood there for a long time, the taste of dust in his mouth and the echo of the horse's presence lingering in his chest. The next morning Eli was back at the same spot, waiting. He had come early before his father had woken, and sat on the same rock by the creek. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft, golden light over the land. The wind had shifted and the air was cool, but Eli didn't notice. His thoughts were consumed by the stallion, by the connection they had shared the day before. The prairie seemed different today, quieter. The wind wasn't as fierce and the grass didn't sway with the same urgency. It was as if the land itself was waiting for something to happen. Eli watched the horizon, his heart heavy with anticipation. He didn't know why, but he felt certain that Shadowman would appear again today. He had to. And then, as if answering his unspoken plea, the black stallion appeared on the ridge. This time there was no hesitation. No long moments of stillness. The horse came straight toward him, his powerful legs eating up the distance between them. Eli's pulse quickened as the stallion neared. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply stood, hands by his sides, waiting for the horse to come to him. The wind picked up again, tugging at Eli's shirt sleeves. He could feel the tension in the air, the raw energy of the moment building. The stallion was close now, so close that Eli could see the fine scars on his neck, the evidence of past battles fought and lost. The horse's eyes locked onto Eli's, and for a brief moment, the world around them seemed to vanish. It was just the two of them, alone in the vastness of the prairie, understanding each other in a way that words could never capture. Eli slowly took off his hat again, this time with more purpose, more certainty. He placed it on the ground, his heart racing in his chest. This time the stallion didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his breath visible in the cold morning air. For a moment, Eli thought the world might stop spinning, but instead, Shadowman lowered his head, his breath soft against Eli's hand. Eli reached out again, this time with a steadier hand. His fingers brushed the stallion's muzzle, and the connection between them was no longer just a moment of understanding. It was something deeper, something unspoken, something that bound them together in a way Eli couldn't explain. Days passed, and Eli returned to the same spot on the prairie, each time hoping for the stallion's return. But as the days wore on, the wild horse became an elusive shadow, appearing only briefly before disappearing into the hills. Eli waited, alone, as if holding his breath, not sure if the connection they had shared was a fleeting moment or something more profound. His father noticed the change in him. Lucas had always been a man of few words, but lately, even he couldn't ignore the quiet distance growing between them. The ranch was busier than ever, repairs to fences, cattle to herd, crops to tend, but Eli's mind wasn't on the work anymore. His heart and thoughts were with Shadowman, and with the feeling that, somehow, their paths were meant to cross again. Eli spent the evenings sitting by the creek, staring at the empty land, listening to the rustling of the trees, waiting. Each morning he rose before the sun, making his way to the familiar rock by the creek, eyes scanning the horizon. But each day the stallion remained out of reach. The silence began to weigh on Eli's shoulders. He could feel the loss growing inside him, not just the loss of his mother, but the emptiness that came from being unable to connect with anyone. His father, his only remaining family, was there physically, but emotionally they were worlds apart. Eli tried, but the wall between them was made of years of unspoken grief, and no matter how hard he tried, it didn't seem like there was a way to break through. One evening, after a long day of working the ranch with his father, Eli sat on the porch looking out over the land. The wind had picked up again, its harshness tugging at his clothes. He heard his father's heavy boots behind him, the sound familiar yet distant. "You still watching for him?" Lucas's voice was low, the words carrying the weight of years of unspoken thoughts. Eli didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to the horizon, his heart heavy with the uncertainty that seemed to define his life lately. "I just want to understand," he whispered. "I want to know why he comes and why he leaves." Lucas didn't reply. Instead, he sat beside Eli, the two of them sharing the quiet of the evening. The land stretched before them, endless and unforgiving, just like the grief they carried inside. But for the first time, Eli felt something shift, something unspoken, in the space between them. His father didn't need to say the words, he understood more than Eli realized. The next day, Eli woke earlier than usual, a strange sense of urgency in his chest. He didn't know what had changed, but something in him told him today would be different. His father had been quiet the night before, but something about the silence had made Eli feel as if he wasn't as alone as he thought. Maybe, just maybe, he could bridge the gap between them. He made his way to the same creek, the morning mist clinging to the grass. The air was cool and the sky was overcast, a soft gray blanket covering the land. The world was still, as if holding its breath. Eli sat on his rock again, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting. It wasn't long before he saw him. Shadowman appeared from the trees, his silhouette dark against the pale sky. The stallion moved slowly at first, as if unsure of his surroundings, but with each step, he grew bolder. Eli's heart raced, but this time he didn't reach for the apple or the hat. Instead, he simply stood, waiting for the horse to come to him. The wind had quieted, and the world seemed to still in anticipation. Shadowman moved closer, his dark eyes locked onto Eli's. The connection between them, fragile as it was, seemed to grow stronger with each passing second. The stallion was no longer a distant figure on the edge of the prairie. He was here with Eli, and in that moment, it felt as if the world had narrowed to just the two of them. Eli held his breath, not wanting to scare the horse, not wanting to break the delicate thread of understanding they had built. And then, with a soft snort, Shadowman took another step forward, until he was just a few feet away. Eli could see the scars on his neck more clearly now, marks of a past filled with struggle. The stallion's breath came in shallow puffs, his body tense with the weight of years of freedom and fear. And then, in a moment of quiet understanding, the stallion lowered his head, just enough for Eli to reach out. Without hesitation, Eli extended his hand, his fingers brushing against the stallion's muzzle. The warmth of his breath, the roughness of his coat, it all felt so real, so right. For the first time, Eli didn't feel alone. Shadowman was here with him, and in that moment, Eli realized that this wasn't just about taming a wild horse. It was about finding a place for himself in the world, about discovering that he wasn't as lost as he had once believed. Eli stood still, his heart hammering in his chest as Shadowman took another step forward. The stallion's muscles rippled under his glossy black coat, his eyes sharp and intelligent. There was no aggression, no fear in the horse's gaze, just a quiet understanding that seemed to reach Eli deep inside. For a moment, Eli could almost feel the weight of the horse's past, the battles fought, the freedom lost, and the silence of isolation. It was as if the stallion too had been waiting for something, someone, to bridge the gap between them. Eli reached out slowly, his hand trembling slightly as it hovered near the horse's neck. Shadowman's breath was warm against his skin, the air filled with the earthy scent of the prairie. Eli's fingers brushed against the stallion's mane, the softness of it grounding him in a way he hadn't felt before. For a brief second, it felt as if everything in his life, the grief, the loneliness, the distance between him and his father, had faded away. It was just him and Shadowman, two souls connected by an understanding that went beyond words. But just as quickly as the moment had come, the stallion pulled back, stepping away from Eli. His hooves struck the ground, sending a ripple of dust into the air, and in an instant he was gone. Shadowman didn't run, but he moved with purpose, his powerful legs carrying him across the land as if he belonged to it. Eli stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where the stallion had been. His hand still tingled from the brief contact, but the emptiness inside him hadn't faded. Shadowman was wild, and wild things couldn't be tamed, couldn't be held. Eli had learned that lesson once before when his mother had passed. There were some things you couldn't hold on to no matter how tightly you tried. But something had shifted inside him. Eli knew now that he wasn't meant to control Shadowman, just as he wasn't meant to control the grief that still lingered in his heart. The stallion had come to him, had trusted him, even if only for a moment. And that was enough. The next day, Eli found himself walking the same path, but his steps felt heavier now. The quiet of the prairie weighed on him, pressing down on his chest with every step he took. Shadowman hadn't returned, and for the first time since the stallion had appeared, Eli felt the loss keenly. It was as if the horse had taken a part of him with him when he left, leaving Eli with nothing but a lingering emptiness. Eli's father had been quieter than usual, his gaze distant as they worked the ranch. The days had become routine again, the rhythm of work returning like the steady beat of a drum. But Eli couldn't focus on the cattle, the fences, or the crops. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Shadowman, of the wild horse that had come and gone like a fleeting dream. He had tried to talk to his father about it, about the connection he felt with the stallion, but Lucas only nodded and mumbled something about wild things not sticking around. It was as if his father couldn't understand, couldn't grasp what Eli had felt in those brief moments of connection. The truth was Eli didn't understand it himself. He didn't know what had drawn him to that wild horse, but he knew that it had been something deep within him, something he couldn't put into words. Shadowman was more than just a horse. He was a symbol of everything Eli had longed for, freedom, understanding, and a sense of belonging. But now, as he walked the familiar path toward the creek, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something he could never get back. The world felt quieter, emptier without the stallion's presence, and Eli wondered if he was destined to always feel this way, forever searching for something that was just out of reach. The days turned into weeks and still there was no sign of Shadowman. Eli continued to go to the creek every morning, hoping, praying that the stallion would return. But each day the prairie remained empty, and the land stretched out before him, endless and quiet. One evening, as Eli sat on the porch with his father, Lucas finally spoke. "You're still waiting for him, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low but not unkind. Eli nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His throat felt tight, and for the first time in a long while, he realized how much he had been holding back. The grief he had buried deep inside him, the loss of his mother, the emptiness of not knowing where he belonged, it all bubbled to the surface. He had been trying so hard to hold it together, to keep the walls up, but the weight of it was becoming too much to bear. Lucas seemed to sense it. He didn't say anything right away but sat beside Eli, his arm resting on the back of the chair. The two of them sat in silence, listening to the soft rustling of the wind, the occasional call of a bird in the distance. It was the first time in months that Eli felt a sense of connection with his father. "I know you miss her," Lucas said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I do too." Eli didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The words hung between them, unspoken but understood. For the first time since his mother's death, Eli felt something shift inside him. It wasn't a miracle, and it wasn't a sudden change, but it was enough to make him realize that he wasn't alone. He had been trying to carry the weight of everything on his own, but he didn't have to. His father was there even if it didn't always feel like it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Eli felt a small spark of hope ignite inside him. It wasn't much, but it was something. Eli woke early the next morning as he had every day for the past few weeks. The air was crisp and the sky was clear, the first sign of a change in the weather. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. The weight in his chest, the feeling of loss and longing, was still there, but it wasn't as suffocating as it had been. He made his way to the creek, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. The land was still, the only sound the wind whispering through the trees. As he reached his usual spot by the water, he stopped. There, standing at the edge of the creek, was Shadowman. The stallion's dark coat gleamed in the early morning light, and his eyes locked onto Eli's. The world seemed to pause in that moment as if time itself was holding its breath. Eli didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, his heart racing, his chest tight with a mix of hope and disbelief. Shadowman took a step forward, then another. Slowly, cautiously, as if unsure of the boy's intentions. But this time Eli didn't reach for the apple, didn't take off his hat. He simply held out his hand, a gesture of trust, of understanding. The stallion stopped a few feet away, his eyes never leaving Eli's. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a moment of quiet recognition, as if both Eli and the stallion understood that they had both been waiting for this. And then, without warning, Shadowman lowered his head, his muzzle brushing against Eli's hand. The touch was electric, a jolt of connection that ran through Eli's entire body. Shadowman's muzzle was warm against his skin, and in that moment, everything around them seemed to fade. The world, with all its weight and worries, disappeared. There was only the two of them, Eli, the boy who had been waiting, and Shadowman, the wild stallion who had come back when least expected. Eli's hand trembled as he stroked the stallion's neck, the roughness of the horse's coat grounding him in a way nothing else ever had. He had been so afraid of losing this moment, of never feeling the connection they had once shared. But now, as the stallion stood before him as calm as Eli had ever felt, there was no need for fear. Shadowman wasn't just an animal. He wasn't something to be controlled or owned. He was a creature who had chosen to trust, to be seen. "Thank you," Eli whispered, though he knew Shadowman couldn't understand the words. But he could understand the quiet gratitude in Eli's voice. He could feel the sincerity in the boy's touch, the weight of the longing that had driven Eli to return to this spot day after day. Eli closed his eyes for a brief moment, breathing in the scent of the prairie and the horse. The soft morning light painted the world in shades of gold, the air thick with the promise of something more. He wasn't sure what it was, but in that instant he knew that this connection, this brief moment of peace, was all he needed. When Eli opened his eyes again, he noticed something different. Shadowman was standing taller, his head lifted, his ears flicking back and forth, alert. The stallion was still calm, but something in his posture had changed. It was as if he was ready to go, ready to leave again. Eli's heart tightened at the thought of losing him again, but this time the fear wasn't there. He had learned that some things couldn't be held onto. Some things, like Shadowman, were meant to be free. With a soft breath, Eli stepped back, giving the stallion space to move. Shadowman's gaze never left him, as if waiting for a signal, a decision. And then, as if understanding, Shadowman turned and slowly walked away, his steps deliberate, yet unhurried. He didn't gallop, didn't flee. He walked as though he had made his peace, as if he had come to say goodbye without saying a word. Eli stood still, watching the stallion disappear into the horizon. His heart ached, but there was a quiet understanding settling inside him. Shadowman wasn't meant to stay, but he had come back, if only for a brief moment. And that was enough. Days passed, and the land began to shift with the season. The cool air of autumn crept in, bringing with it a change that was felt deeply by Eli. He continued with the daily tasks around the ranch, working alongside his father in the same rhythm they had always shared. But something had changed inside Eli. He no longer felt the same loneliness that had once consumed him. The connection with Shadowman had given him something he hadn't realized he was missing, a sense of peace, of acceptance. Lucas had noticed the change too. He no longer saw the wall between them that had been there for so long. Instead, there was a quiet understanding in the air, a bond that had been formed without words. And for the first time in months, Eli felt like he wasn't carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders alone. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, Lucas spoke again, his voice softer than usual. "You know, your mom used to talk about horses like they were more than just animals," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "She always said they had a way of seeing things we couldn't. That they understood us, even when we didn't understand ourselves." Eli looked up from his plate, surprised by the words. He had never heard his father speak about his mother in such a way. The grief that had always been present in his father's eyes was still there, but there was something else, something Eli couldn't quite place. It was a moment of connection, a brief acknowledgement of the loss they had both endured. "She was right," Eli said quietly. "Shadowman didn't need to be tamed. He just needed someone to understand him." Lucas nodded, his eyes softening. "Maybe that's true," he replied. "Maybe it's time we start understanding each other better too." And in that moment, Eli realized that the bond he had with Shadowman wasn't just about the stallion. It was about the way he had learned to understand himself, and the way his relationship with his father was beginning to change. They didn't need to speak about the pain that lingered between them. They were starting to understand each other in their own quiet way. The days grew shorter as winter began to settle over the prairie. The snow came gently at first, dusting the land with a quiet, white blanket. Eli continued his work on the ranch, but he felt lighter now, the weight of his grief and loneliness no longer holding him back. Shadowman hadn't returned, but in a way Eli had come to accept that the stallion had moved on, just as he had. It was late one afternoon as Eli walked along the fence line, that he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. There, in the distance, was Shadowman. The stallion stood still, his dark coat blending into the snowy landscape, his gaze fixed on Eli. This time, there was no fear, no hesitation in the horse's eyes. He was calm, steady, as if waiting for Eli to make the next move. Eli stood there for a long moment, the cold wind biting at his skin. But instead of rushing forward, he simply watched the stallion. He didn't need to control him, didn't need to make him stay. He understood now that some things like Shadowman were meant to be free. And sometimes love meant letting go. As he stood there, his heart filled with a quiet sense of peace, Eli smiled. He had learned the most important lesson of all, that love, true love, doesn't bind or possess. It simply understands, accepts, and lets go when the time is right. Shadowman took one final look at Eli before turning and walking into the hills. Eli watched him disappear, his heart full but light. He had given the stallion what he needed, and in doing so, he had found the peace he had been searching for all along. And as the wind whispered through the snow, Eli knew that this wasn't the end, but simply the beginning of something new.